to FSElite. I'm Tim.
And I'm Lee. You may know us from our channel Flight Brothers FT.
Welcome to this FSElite review of the Just Flight Vulcan B.2. Update notice, version 1.1 of the Vulcan has been released since recording began on this video. This entire video is shot using version 1. If you'd like to see the changes that have come since then, you can check the full article at FSElite.net. The textures on this Vulcan are basically perfect. The wing curvatures accurately reflect the angles that do exist on the wing. If you look at it from an upper view, you'll notice it is not one continuous curve. There are a few angles there. The cockpit canopy does reflect a separate segmented piece, and that's an ejectable component on the real aircraft. The engine intakes are beautifully done. It just looks great the whole way down the shaft. We have belly details with all of the finer equipment that is underneath the aircraft. And honestly, it's so good looking that while I was researching this, I stumbled across a aerial photo of X-Ray Hotel 558, and I actually mistook it for the Just Flight Vulcan. It's just because the lighting on that image made it look like an X-plane, and then I realized it was actually an image trying to get you to go visit the museum with X-Ray Hotel 558.
Well, if we ever pop over to jolly old England, Tim, maybe we should try that sometime.
It's definitely on my list, Lee.
Hey, so since you've covered textures, let's go ahead and move on to animations here. And it's got quite a few on this Just Flight version. The air brakes are modeled both upper and lower with two positions, and actually it has a third position when the gear is down. The second position extends even further. Drag chute is also modeled. That has a cover door and a cable mounting point that also is nicely rendered. The K2 tanker configuration has the hose and drogue with a nice extension and retraction animation and some painting underneath it for guidance for refueling aircraft. The bomb bay doors, of course, animated, and a variety of weapons and fuel tanks are selectable and modeled as well, including the blue steel mounting, which was a tactical standoff nuclear cruise missile.
All right. So one of the cool things with that blue steel is it actually, when you install it, shall we say, to the aircraft, it will actually change the bomb bay doors. They will indent so that blue steel can be partially mounted external without being completely drag creating device underneath. We also have a very nicely rendered crew hatch with the extendable ladder, which is great for on-the-ground realism. You have an optional panel gauge glare. So when you're inside the aircraft, if you want it to look realistically reflecting the sun, you can turn that on. If it's annoying you and you just want to read it better, you can turn it back off. You have working windshield wipers that operate at two speeds, a low and a high. Documentation says this does have Livery plugin integration, but neither Lee nor I has actually tried that out, so we can't actually tell you if it works, but I'm willing to take them at their word for it.
Whoops.
Sorry guys, we don't mess around with rain that much. Ground equipment, it does have a power cart and an air cart. That's not how they label it in there, but that's essentially what it is: external power and air, both to the starboard gear and to the port rear side. We have 17 included liveries, and I should say livery slash configurations. You have 11 different Vulcan bombers. You have 4 K2 tanker configurations and 2 MRRs, which are maritime radar reconnaissance versions, and you can add on pods to the wings for all of the electronic equipment that comes with that. A few of these liveries are camo. Some have camo on the belly. Some have a flat colored gray or white belly. Some are a full anti-flash white, which is what the original B Mark I would have looked like and the early B Mark IIs had. Now, this is great because there's only 19 surviving Vulcans on planet Earth. And so you have 17 here, so you're doing pretty well. Although the 17 they've given you are not exactly of the 19 that are left. A couple of them are the remaining Vulcans that are out there.
As we move to the cockpit, it's incredibly realistic. They've really modeled the light and how it reflects off the gauges. Everything looks nice in here. It almost has that, and Tim, you and I have made this comment before, old military hardware has a smell. The modeling is
Smells
so
like
good that
history.
exactly, yeah, it almost has that appearance that you could smell the old militariness of
Smells
it.
like old canvas and oil.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, you know it's gonna smell good when you walk up to it there. Nearly everything inside works or has some type of clickable function or region. There's a couple things that don't, I think, that we've identified. We'll take a look at those or mention those a little later. Your armrests are animated, and the center pedestal, if I could call it that, it actually stows away underneath the throttle quadrant. So there's a handle on the back. You can pull it out, which contains your autopilot and your fuel pumps. And there are 5 movable window shades. The 2 on the round windows on the side actually slide up and down.
All right, now those are all great, and I have to admit, I found the pedestal slider by accident before I found it in the documentation. And then you had showed me actually, I think I was talking to you when I discovered the window shades, and then you mentioned that all 5 of them move. And I have to say, both of those features struck me as above and beyond because they're not really necessary. As a developer, you could have left those out. Well, since we're
And
not
since I've
literally in there,
since
we're not inconvenienced by climbing over that autopilot fuel panel.
I've never been in a Vulcan to tell you forgot that.
Exactly. So to me, that's a level above and beyond the expected. Well, I need a Vulcan that looks real and sounds real. But that wasn't necessary. So here's a surprise in the other direction.
Sure.
Everything we've said so far, guys, I'm extremely positive about and loved. This was the first thing that surprised me and kind of I'm a little surprised this isn't here. In the pilot seats, if you turn around, you should be looking at the rear crew with nav plotter, nav radar, and the air electronics officer. But instead, you're looking at some sort of fabric cover with zippers, which I suppose actually is probably a legit shade screen that may have actually existed in a Vulcan to keep the rear crew from being blinded or flying into the sun. But they chose not to render it. Now, I'm going to apologize for them. I suspect what happened, because everything in the front cockpit where you're actually going to fly this as a sim pilot works. We're talking 99% functional. Even things you don't really need, like the sliding panel, are there. So I suspect because they were going for that level of authenticity, they didn't want to phone it in on a rear section that you weren't going to use. Now, some of those rear features did find their way to the front through the graphical user interface, which I shall call GUI from now on. On the GUI,
You don't want to pronounce that?
GUI. On the GUI, you've got 2 different electrical panels that I'm fairly certain would have been the air electronic officer's responsibility in flight. And if you don't do the cold and dark, you can basically skip using those. But if you want to run through the cold and dark procedures, you get to do everybody's job, and that will include those. And I don't think you're going to really miss the rear. I'm only pointing it out because as we go through this review, you're going to notice, hey, there's like nothing missing here at all, except for this.
Yeah, that's the only thing that's not there.
It's the only thing, man. I can't think of anything else that they skipped. That was it.
Sure. Well, should we move on to sounds?
Now, I have to admit, before you start the sounds, I was told by Jordan before we got this, he said the sounds alone are enough to want to buy this aircraft. Do you think he was right?
Well, I think I mentioned to you on the phone, I'm not typically a military aviator, especially in X-plane. This is well worth the cost of entry. I would say that.
I'll tell you what, the sounds did it for me. I put on my headphones and cranked it up because I was...
That's not surprising at all.
I was eating sub. Of the 2 of us, if you haven't seen any Flight Brothers videos or our previous ones, I'm the sound nerd, which isn't surprising. My day job is as a music teacher. All right, so Lee, You're going to start out the sound. Go for it.
Okay, so sounds. Of course, what Vulcan would not be complete without the signature howl. It is modeled accurately, both from the interior and the exterior. Yeah, it is quite authentic to anything that you could find out there on the internet. So they did a fantastic job modeling that.
Yeah, I would say hands down that was the #1 sound that had to be here, and they gave it to you, and it's great. Pretty much from what, about 80% thrust on up, definitely 90% to 100. You're getting a howl,
for sure.
and it's very dynamic. It's great.
You do get the pitch change as well.
Right, it doesn't sound like a, oh, they went out and recorded one thing and it's not dynamic. It feels very realistic. You're going to like it.
Sure.
All right, so moving on to the more typical sounds that most aircrafts would have, we have all of our cockpit switches, knobs, guards, and that's really important for your immersion level, so it's nice to have all of those. So everything you touch pretty much is going to make a sound, and it along with the visual textures, the immersion level in this cockpit is fantastic. Your bomb bay does make a sound, so you can hear that opening and closing.
And in the Vulcan, since you've got a massive delta wing, it's it's like a very short fuselage short of a flying wing. So you've got a lot of airflow going around the canopy there. And you actually do get wind noise changes as your angle of attack. So if you begin to pull more G's from the flight deck, you hear that airflow pitch changing, almost as it delaminates or just changes the way it flows over there, which is very nice. I was quite surprised by that. Discovered it quite accidentally on my first flight before I stalled, spun it, and crashed it into the ground.
Now, Lee, you were the first one to clue me into this. I did not discover this myself. After you mentioned, you had told me, hey, if you load up the wing, you'll start to hear that air disruption. I banked it real hard and just started pulling some decent G's. And this aileron turns out, wow, I got a good whoosh. And so we'll put some of those sounds in here in a moment, but it's a very satisfying sound. So, I mean, I really felt like all of these things are just adding to the layers of really good immersion that makes this thing feel like, hey, the last Vulcan may be parked, but this is a pretty good substitute for those of us on the ground. It's not like anyone was going to let you fly the real one anyway.
That's true. If you're lucky, you might get to hear a taxi test here or there, right?
Right. There's 3 of them can still do that. So
there you go.
And actually, I believe, if I understand correctly, in the documentation, they thanked one of the surviving Vulcans for letting them come in and take photographs and whatnot. And I wonder if the F-mod was actually created from one of the taxiable Vulcans. I wouldn't be surprised to find that's the case. So
yeah, I would agree.
Being a nerd, and I'm kind of the small child in the cockpit when it comes to these things, Lee tends to go more by the book. I'm just like, ooh, look, a shiny button. Let's click it. So I looked over my seat and said, oh, look, stripy handles. And so I pulled them. And when you pull those, that's actually the ejectors. There's one on the pilots and the co-pilots. The effect for you will be the same. So if you're in the pilot's seat, you cannot just eject your co-pilot. You're both going to go. And when you pull this, you're going to get a sound. I'll leave it in here. They're going to say eject, eject, eject.
Eject, eject, eject.
Later, you'll be ejected from the aircraft. You will see the Vulcan fly away, and you will be stuck in this fixed viewpoint, which does very, very slowly float to the ground to simulate you being in a parachute. Whatever. It's that level of immersion. Are you ever going to need this ejector handle? Is this relevant? No. But does
I
it
could
show...
have used it for my stall spin smoking hole I created.
Oh, there you
Sorry.
go. Lee needed it.
Yeah, once.
It's just that layer of, hey, we gave you all the critical flight details you needed, and then a few things that are just above and beyond. And I would say the eject feature is definitely above and beyond. Let's move to the next topic. Lee, what's up next?
Well, I guess we could talk about the GUI, which tends to stay, it's a clickable region on the left side.
A
Um,
menu for all of you who don't call it graphical user interface. The menu or the GUI.
right, you're right. The menu, the pop-out menu. So you might want to silence your phone there, Tim. That's really unprofessional.
I'm very sorry. My car just finished charging.
So, yeah, it replicates the what was it? The aerial electronics. What was it? AEO
Air Electronics Officer.
officer. There you go. Yeah, I think the Navy or the Air Force, one of them called him a gib, right? Which is guy in back. So it replicates the guy in back with some electrical panels. You also have your autopilot access without looking away from the windscreen.
You know,
The
that's great because this AP is in the same place as it is like in a King Air. It's a real pain to look down there.
I will say, having flown both of them, that this one is easier to access than the King Air. At least I can still see where I'm going.
Absolutely.
Well, I guess it helps that you don't have the heading knob down there in the center like a King Air. Also, there on the GUI, you have window tint, which just, I don't know, it's kind of almost like that sunglasses effect that's in the standard X plane. It just kind of darkens everything a little bit. And from what I understand, the actual Vulcan is quite a dark cockpit with the small windows. And I mean, of course, it was designed as a nuclear bomber, so you wouldn't want a whole lot of light getting in there should the actual mission it was designed for be called upon.
Oh,
And
fun
there's a
fun fact, Lee. They had actual window covers for
there
each
you
of
go.
those windows for the flash. So they would drop the bomb, cover all the windows, so that they would not be blinded by the flash. Anyway, moving on.
Well, see, that is the exact kind of nerdy, geeky details you get with the Flight Brothers.
That's what
So
I'm here for.
there's the panel glare. You can turn that. That's for the gauges, so you can add or remove that as needed. I didn't experience any system issues, Tim. Frames. I didn't run frames. I don't really care. It didn't get choppy, so I didn't notice it was hitting my system. So I never really messed with much of this. I flew it as it was default. How about you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I did not see a single instance of lag. Now, I did not go to any scenery intensive locations. I think you flew some Orbix scenery.
Yeah, that's
No issues.
correct. I did. Yeah, I flew Orbix, South Great Britain. I had that, so I actually flew out of Heathrow and around Windsor Castle and everything, and everything performed fine. All the animations on the instruments, everything worked. So, um,
So,
and I would probably say I have around a mid-tier system.
all right, so one of the things on the GUI here is a flight computer, and I clicked it open once and noticed, hey, numbers, that's more Lee's territory, and closed it. So Lee, why don't you tell us, because I know you did some trips and really actually cross-checked those numbers to the gauges. How
Yeah,
was this computer?
sure. So the flight computer, it measures an instantaneous fuel flow in gallons and liters per hour. So if those are the numbers you deal with, that's really handy. However, it shows the fuel used in gallons. Well, most times in aviation, you use, weight. So that's kind of odd that it would have, kind of, I guess, more of a volumetric measurement as opposed to weight. But overall, I found on an average of three, I would say cross-country flights, they were all approximately 2 hours in duration. I would say rough numbers. You're within about 4 to 5% versus what X plane says. So, as an example flight, I flew to Heathrow to Engelholm. X plane said I used 23,500 pounds, and after I converted the gallons used post flight, it was 26,700. So
So that's
there's
close
a
enough if you're going to do some long range flying with this. It's
right.
not such a margin of error that you might have a problem. You'd probably be all right.
Sure, sure. And of course your fuel gauges, are right there in front of the throttles. So if you keep an eye on those, if you're really trying to push that range. Also on that flight computer, it has an endurance and I believe an estimated range on there as well. So
All right, well, let's hit some of the rest of these GUI features. I'll just run us down through the rest of these. You
sure.
have a window tint, which, granted, you can go pull all five of the sliding glare shields, or you can just click this, It's kind of like putting on sunglasses. There's a panel glare. I think we mentioned that earlier. I'm going to throw in some footage here where you can have the glare on the glass or not. Just personal preference. I'll be honest. I leave it off. I didn't come to a sim plane to be inconvenienced by glare. And that's always fun. If you didn't know this, go ask pilots if they can wear polarized glasses. Because I love polarized glasses, but they're kind of a no-no in cockpits. Cool features. This is a neat one here. At first, I didn't understand what it was for. At the bottom of this GUI, there's a change livery feature. And so I clicked it, and about 20 seconds later, my new livery popped up. But I was on the ground, so I didn't understand because, I can go to the X-Plane menu, scroll through all 17 available liveries, bam, click one, it'll be up in no time. So I'm like, what's the point of this? But then I discovered in flight, you can change the livery in flight. Now, that might not be terribly useful because, again, why are you flying the aircraft in the wrong livery you didn't want? But by the same token, it's still pretty cool because I'm not sure if I have any other aircraft where I can actually change the livery while I am flying without it restarting the mission and putting me on the ground somewhere. So that's a cool one. All right, special features. We kind of hit some of these in the animation section. You've got the refueling drogue that you can kick on out if you're in the K2 variant. You have the drag chute on all of these, which has its hatch and all of that stuff. Those are all available from the GUI. The refueling probe, I think you can only launch from the GUI. The chute can be launched from the panel, and the panel also has the cutaway. The GUI is just a strict, put it out, retract it. On the panel, you have deploy as well as the cutaway. The bomb bay can be opened and closed from here, and again, that duplicates what's on the panel to your left. You have a loadout and ordnance page. Now, this is pretty cool. I have had a varying experience with this because on the ground, it seems like you can pretty much put whatever you want there. When you're in the air, I've had times where it won't let me change it, or it'll let me load up one set of items but not other, and I'm not always clear on how that goes.
Hey, if I can throw in something there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I was flying the K2, I think, for the first couple of flights, and I couldn't add some of the weapons, I think. But today I was flying the MRR, the Maritime, and I was actually able to put the saddle tanks and all the weapons in there. So not sure if it tracks which variant you're using, because the K2 obviously would be a tanker. So that may be it.
And I think there are some options on there that are specifically for the K2. Like you can fill up that bomb bay with fuel tanks. It has there's 3 positions in that bay. There's a front, mid, and rear position. And so you can have 3 fuel tanks, or you can have weapons in the middle and saddle tanks. There's just quite a variety. And the weirdest of them all is that blue steel, because, again, they actually changed the bay doors, and it's an exterior mount that's kind of tucked in a little bit. So really a neat sheet to have. It's very cool. And if I haven't already mentioned this, every one of these GUI pop-out displays is resizable. Did you play with that, Lee? Did you resize any of these?
No, I did not.
Did you note they can be popped into actual windows?
I didn't notice that. I had noticed it could be dragged and moved around a little bit.
Right. So now I don't know why you would actually want to turn this into a Windows window. That makes sense sometimes for an FMC. Like, I'm going to pop out my FMC and jump over to SimBrief and input my very long and complicated flight plan so I can see it. For this aircraft, you don't have that need to reference something like that, but it does it. So, it's nice that it's there. It just might not serve any particular purpose. We've got a couple other things. You can show or hide the Copilot. I think that confused Lee at first, because when you first tried it, you didn't know what it did, right?
So yeah, I clicked it and I looked over to the right, and I didn't see Nigel over there.
Right. Well, we'll get you some footage. If you turn on the Copilot, from the external view, you will have 2 pilots, and they both have the classic regulation aviator mustache that looks more like a broom.
Perfect.
It's lovely. You can show and hide the yokes, so if those were in your way. Although the yoke on these, it's a fighter yoke. It's very small. I gotta be honest, I like seeing it, so I never hit it. And then can we talk
Uh,
about my favorite, Lee?
sure.
The best thing on this GUI, top left corner, power on. Now, if you've ever watched our videos, you know we love a cold and dark. We've got tutorials, and I mean, I'm a big fan of doing things the real way. But I discovered, and this is unique, because usually you get like some chintzy aircraft that can be turned on in 3 clicks, or something that's like, I don't want to fly that today. I don't have half an hour to turn it on. Well, here you've got both. You can cold and dark, or you can click this power on button, engine's running, your Vulcan's ready to go instantly. That amazes me. What did you think of that, Lee?
I've got to be honest. I did engines running for my all of the 4 or 5 flights. I meant to do a cold and dark or one of the rapid starts, but I never did. At least prior to this.
Okay, I did it both ways. I did probably the first 10 times I used the Vulcan, I did the power on because I was just being in a hurry, and then I was like, okay, I really need to go through and run this procedure. And
Sure.
it was very good. I've done one other Sim Vulcan before that was a freeware that was decently done, but this is a quantum leap ahead of where the freeware ever was. And, the interesting thing, though, is, as they say, a sim is a sim. So the procedures were still quite similar. It's just they're far more in depth here. And we have the air electronics panels to power up the electrical systems. And I could tell from doing the cold and dark, even the way they wrote the documentation is like, here's the steps to get you started, but we're not going to explain all the ins and outs of what you're doing. So the level of system depth here is this is not the kiddie pool. There's a lot you can do with this.
Sure, sure.
So speaking of
Well,
systems, shall we?
sorry, go ahead.
Shall we move on to systems?
Yeah, we'll move on to systems. So there is a nav for both the VOR. It's tunable for VOR and ILS. It's on the commander's left side down there. We'll try and show a picture there. It's actually, it hides. You turn 2 knobs and then the green LCD-esque digits pop up, which is a really nice feature. And then they kind of fade away and disappear back into it. So
I got a
it
question,
doesn't.
Lee, because I love
Yeah,
that feature.
yeah.
I thought that was the coolest thing that those, because they added something that's not there, but they did it in
Correct.
a way that doesn't seem cheesy.
Mm-hmm.
But that it left me wondering. I wonder what the actual display was.
It'd probably be, I'd imagine, be almost like those little roller wheels, or thumb switches, and probably run by the guy in the back.
Oh, that's a good point. Very good point.
I mean, that would be my guess. I mean, the pilot may have one type of auxiliary one or an emergency one up there, but yeah, I imagine it'd be mostly run from the back seat.
All right.
And speaking of those lights, in front of the co-pilot, in front of his right knee there's a panel which I believe is not actually there in the real aircraft, but it's a comm panel, and if you turn the top left 3 knobs, those are the ADF frequency, and they function the same way. They actually have a slightly slower fade out, I noticed, than on the commander side there for the VOR and ILS,
All
but
right.
they're there.
So, one of the things that I found the most absolutely mystifying, and this is an Avro thing, this is not Just Flight's problem. The HSI on the pilot side, instead of having a course deviation indicator that spins within a magnetic heading card,
Mm-hmm.
you spin the card and your magnetic heading is a needle. And my brain, as much as I understand that, I don't even know if that made sense the way I said it, but my brain is having such a hard time dealing with that as I was flying, I mean, the couple times I flew this, it was not enough to recalibrate my brain to the way that instrument works. And I mean, it's the same as a typical GA HSI would be, or anything older in the steam gauge era might have this. It's just the fact that you're spinning the card instead of the CDI needles was just messing with
Right.
my head.
Well, and on top of that, the presentation, because your actual heading for your autopilot. Actually, let me go back to there's a tag. Let me go back to the navigation just a little bit, and then I'm going to come back to that, Tim. There's a TAC and DME indicator in the center panel, and it's kind of a cheat. It's almost a pointer to the beacon, and it has a distance that'll go out to about 200 miles. Maybe we can show a picture of that, or perhaps a video up there. That will also function with your GPS active. Now, this does have a cheat GPS. It's tied to defaulted to one of the buttons on my joystick here, and it runs the Garmin 430. And also, when the GPS is active, or actually your VOR, if you're picking it up, it doesn't show over 100 miles. It starts from 99, counts down. Now there is, and a way to catch this, and you have to be paying attention here. Once that counts down, hits 0, goes back to 99. Let's say you're further than 100 miles. There's a gauge by the commander's right knee. It's
Such
an
a weird
analog gauge.
I swear it looks like a gas tank gauge.
Yeah, yeah, it looks like a gas tank gauge, and it's 20 miles to 0. So that one starts counting down as well. So that's kind of how you know, am I greater than 100 miles, or am I in the final few miles there?
Now,
So
now really, one of the things I've been debating is in an aircraft with 2 designated navigation experts in the back, the pilot's really not going to be troubled with this. It's really us sim captains who are doing a little more work because you don't have the rest of the crew. So, if you had your flight plan and a navigator, you're not going to be in a position where you wonder, is that next VOR 28 nautical miles or 128? I'm not sure.
right,
That's not going to happen with 2 navigators on board.
true. And honestly, if you do the VORs, I think you're generally more active in the progression of the flight anyway than what you are when you say throw it on the GPS.
Right, yeah.
If we could move to the comm radios there, Tim. Just Flight did a very interesting presentation with this. Just above where the VOR beacons are, there's these knobs that almost, the first time I saw it, I thought it was a transponder, which
Same
I
here.
did not find a transponder on here. But since you're using VHF frequencies in this, they drop the 1. So, for example, to dial up 121.5, you would dial 2150. And it's interesting because it allows the panel to, look the vintage that it is. It doesn't disrupt it visually, but you still have that functionality.
Yeah, it was weird when I first looked at it. I was thinking the same thing, like, what is it? And then it wasn't until that very moment that it occurred to me, they all start with a 1. The 1 is completely superfluous. So, there'd be no reason to have a knob to only do 1. So, did you notice just above the nav and the comm radios, you've got your weapons panels and some there's a whole bunch of orange lights over there, which are part of the flight control systems and some augmented flight stuff. But if you move farther up that panel, you have oxygen systems, and this is a pretty cool one. So the aircraft has a normal sort of cruise mode and a combat mode, and it will change the pressurization setting of the cabin from, I believe, the normal mode is like a 9 psi for the inside of the pressure hull to combat mode, which is 4. And I would assume the rationale for that being, in combat, you might change altitudes more rapidly, so you don't want to risk having this highly pressurized cabin and you're stressing the airframe. Also in combat, back when this thing was designed, being intercepted by a fighter on your way to a nuclear bomb run, that was a real concern. So taking a couple rounds from the machine gun of a interception fighter, the less PSI on that, the less chance I should think you would have of an explosive decompression that would really damage the hull and jeopardize the aircraft. So I'm assuming that's the combat mode for us. Now, the reason I'm rambling about all that is the oxygen system here actually, there's a little, like, it's like a white ball indicator. It's going to light up when you are receiving oxygen as the pilot from the oxygen tank. You only need to receive that oxygen above the altitude the cabin's pressurization doesn't give you enough. So at a certain altitude, you need pure oxygen, and in combat mode, sometimes. So, I mean, this is, again, another one of those above and beyond features. Do you ever really need the oxygen to be rendered? I mean, this is just a sim. But they kind of went all the way with it there, and I really appreciate that. So, yeah, so their oxygen mask is going to be plugged in as part of their equipment. Actually, their suits are also plugged in because their suits are cooled by the air system on the aircraft. And so when I'm messaging that oxygen, it's going to, you can watch that meter to know if it is pumping you oxygen, because there is a finite amount of oxygen stored on board the ship. And that's why it would be relevant if you're pumping it all out pure or not, because if you're pumping pure oxygen, you will eventually run out of it on your trip. All right, but again, the oxygen system doesn't affect you that much. I'm just pointing it out because it's such a cool, they went all the way with this kind of detail. All right, so
I never messed with it, actually, so it's good that one of us played with it.
Well, one of us was reading the manual because I had some time when I was on baby duty the other day and I couldn't fly, but I
skimmed it.
All right.
Speaking of manual, we didn't talk about that. It comes with a great manual.
89 pages, I believe, worth of documentation.
Yeah. I printed a few out so I could have almost kind of some quick reference. I had a checklist in it. Man, we should have really started off with that, I think.
That's because that's where we start. I don't think that's where everybody starts. I think everybody starts with the textures and sounds. So don't worry, that's where we started this video.
Okay, well, let's kick it back to what we've got planned here.
Some cool things, again, in the above and beyond. I already told you about the ejector seat, but a neat little cockpit feature. The safety pins for the ejector seat. There's 3 of them on both seats. That's in the procedures, in the documentation. And that's another one of those things you get to skip if you just click the power on button. But if you do the cold and dark, you have to remove those pins, and they actually get stowed on the left and right panel, so you can see them just hanging there beside the pilot and the co-pilot. Again, an above and beyond feature to my mindset. So that probably about wraps up system and procedures. But since you mentioned the documentation, Lee, I noticed a nice mix. It's like that power button. The documentation actually reflected the aircraft, where it had, hey, if you just want to get started, here's kind of the basics and go. And then there was the full on, hey, if you want to geek out and really try and use all the elaborate systems, here's another 65 pages of details. So
I
go for it.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I agree. When we downloaded these, that was one of the first things I did that evening. The family was hanging out watching TV, and I'm just sitting over there, probably badly, on the phone, skimming the document, and I'm like, oh, okay. Wow, didn't know that. So it was full, like you said, of had a good mix of the information, the easily digestible, quick stuff. But then if you wanted to know more in-depth systems, the information was there as well.
Right, so you can jump in and go, or you can fully geek out, either way. All right, well, let's get moving on to the flight dynamics. One of the things that you will notice if you're playing with the loadout sheet, if you're on the ground, you'll actually see the aircraft squat or sit up if you add or remove a heavy item, which, that's not that uncommon in X-Plane. If you change fuel load, you'll often see that happen. Ground handling, I got some video footage of this. It is very agile on the ground. It is very easy to taxi and very enjoyable. So I just messed around with it. And one of the reasons I kind of pushed it on this is because back when I had messed around with the freeware one, the free one that's out on the internet, it's actually a real booger to taxi. It's very, very difficult to taxi. So I really appreciated the fact that this thing was enjoyable to drive around on the ground.
Sure. Well, that's what it was designed for, driving around. I I'm just kidding.
There is a
Yeah,
Vulcan for driving, but it's not this one.
that's it. Well, that's all they can do now, unfortunately. And further onto the flight dynamics, I'll kind of breeze through these a little bit, hitting largely takeoff, climb, cruise, approach, and landing. So, as I'd mentioned, I've had about 5 or 6 flights with this. 3 of these cross country. One I did with GPS. Two I was doing with just VOR. One of the unique characteristics is once you bring it up, of course, you get that distinctive howl as the engines come on. But at takeoff, you don't really need to add back pressure. It just kind of rotates and goes. And speaking of that, you get a pretty steep deck angle. The VSI on this vertical speed indicator pegs at 4,000. You're at or above 4,000 feet climb for quite a while. I actually took this at the max fuel, and then I adjusted the load out to where I was at max takeoff weight there, or whatever that's indicated through the through X-Plane. I hit 45,000 feet in about 17 minutes, 17 to 18 minutes, and that was at 250 knots. So the thing climbs like
Well, I've got some
well,
footage to throw in here. This was not
okay.
on purpose, actually. I was screwing around with something else. I had lifted off and it sort of over rotated on me and I wasn't paying attention. I ended up in a vertical climb to
Hmm.
6,000 feet before I started paying attention again and leveled it out. Didn't stall out. And when I went and reviewed the replay, it just skyrocketed, literally,
Oh
like
yeah,
a rocket to
yeah,
6,000
yeah.
feet. No problem. Hooray for
Yeah,
turbojets.
yeah, no, it's crazy. It's quite powerful. I mean, 20,000 pounds of thrust each engine doesn't seem like a whole lot, and you're pushing 200,000 pounds, 203, I think this thing sits at. So I mean, I guess you're still what's that, about 5 to 1, power to weight. But yeah, it's a climber. There's no flight profile that I recall in the documentation, so I was climbing and descending at 250 knots indicated. That's probably slightly unrealistic. I imagine a climb would be probably 270 to 300. But anyway, like I said, at 250 knots indicated, 45,000 feet in under 20 minutes. Pretty impressive. Moving on to the cruise, there's no auto throttle, but I don't know what you think about this, Tim. I found once you were up there, kind of, I think Mach 8.5 to just over Mach point 0.9 is where she likes to be, 45 to 50,000 feet. The highest I took her was 45,000, and speed control's pretty easy.
Yeah, I found that too. I had just kind of picked a number. I think I was flying Mach 0.91 or 0.92. I was probably a little faster than I should have been. But it was no big deal. I pretty much found a spot on the throttle and it held. So it was not, we've had that experience before with some of the other classic airliners where you're kind of constantly chasing. Like you really have to mind the airspeed.
Sure.
But with this, you could kind of find a throttle setting and it basically held. So, and again, that might be a function of we're screwing around with turbojets, and it's a very different dynamic than high bypass or low bypass airliners. So that's going to really play into the approach. So how did you find the
Sure.
approach to be on this thing, Lee?
I came in quite a few times. I found it easy to be too high and too fast, especially too fast. When you're descending, I think the overall drag profile is pretty low on this. So it's easy to come into the terminal area running, say, 220 knots, and then you pitch down. And if you're not paying attention, you can easily go into a 2, 3, 4,000 feet a minute vertical descent. And man, she builds speed. You'll be at 250 knots in no time, busting that. So I found that really surprising. On approach, I like to be around 170 or so, but come final, when I'm probably inside 5 miles, 3 to 5 miles out, I stick the speed brakes out because it just gives you that little extra resistance, and
Right.
then just control it with pitch.
And that
Again,
agrees with
even,
the manual.
yeah, and even in the flare, it's really easy to balloon, so you do not want extra speed.
And I think this is pretty indicative of any of these classic aircraft. They're very heavy, and just the way these older jet engines work, they're not, you don't have an enormous gaping fan sticking out there that when you put it at idle creates some resistance and drag on its own. So even at idle, these turbojets are still putting out a decent amount of thrust. So you can pretty much expect on landing, you're going to use speed brakes. You're going to want the drag chute. And if you are over speed, you are not going to find a way to bleed it off.
Well, and like Concorde, these things they're generating their lift differently than a conventional airplane.
Yeah, basically, actually even more so than Concorde.
Mm-hmm.
There's very little of this aircraft that is not a wing. There's a wing, there's a vertical, and we stuck out a little bit to give you a cockpit. But other than that, it's pretty much a wing.
Yeah, it's almost a blended wing versus Concorde was a pencil on a wing.
Right. So I believe we have pretty much wrapped up the technical details, and I know we've gone on for quite a while, but yeah. I still think it's worth us chatting for a bit because that is what we do. Mm-hmm. And let's be honest, nobody buys a payware level Vulcan so they can go fly their virtual airline routes. You buy the Vulcan because the Vulcan is probably one of 2 or 3 of the most quintessential, classic, iconic British aircraft, right up there with Spitfires and Lancasters. And let's be honest, this is Concorde. You can't claim that it's all British. So this is one the Brits can just take credit for. This is 100% theirs, and it's beautiful.
Wave the Union Jack proudly,
and they love it. So as we get into rambling about it, let's just keep 2 more seconds of technical. Did you have any weird things happen or anything that was wrong?
Yeah, so we discussed this. I could not, when I would go to engage, especially heading mode, or initially turn on the autopilot, which make sure you read the manual, guys, on that. It's not an intuitive process, but it works. When I would go into heading mode, so when I would engage the functionally lateral navigation, I had to do that through the GUI pop-out. However, I could manipulate the vertical speed or vertical profile with the 3D one. So I found that one a little odd. And sometimes when I would change VOR frequencies, I would have to go up on the center panel there where it has, I think there's an empty one, then it's LOC and GS and something else, remote. I'd have to cycle it sometimes back to center. The blank mode is your heading mode, flick it back over to LOC and it would go. I understand you had a different experience though.
I just found sometimes I could always engage the autopilot with the GUI's 2D pop out, and it worked fine.
Okay.
But in the 3D cockpit, sometimes I would reach down there and I could deactivate it, but I had trouble reactivating it. But there was one time I activated it from the 3D and it worked. So I'm gonna put that in it might be user error, but Lee and I have both spent a week and put a decent number of hours on this aircraft, considering we've been flying it for a week. So I'm not going to say
we have
there's
about
anything
10
wrong with it, but yeah, I'm not quite sure what happened there. All right. So I was just wondering, is there anything about this that you would change, with the exception of they left out that rear cabin?
Honestly, no. I mean, I think that's really about it. If you had to nitpick, and honestly, the week or so that we've had this and been flying it around, we've got 10, right at 10 flight hours on it. I've got 2 cross countries flown from different nav sources, and nothing I could complain about, man, to be honest with you. It's like, if you had to pick, it's that back seat. There's just nothing back there, but you don't miss it when you're flying because there's enough to do.
Exactly. I've never actually wanted it. It's just walking around it that you're like, oh, where is it? So
sure.
Just as the last topic here, I've been in love with the Vulcan for quite a while. Ever since I thought in Thunderball as a child, I'm like, that's just a cool plane. And so that's why I jumped on a project to do that freeware for our own Flight Brothers channel a long time ago. And I showed that to you, and you were kind of like, whatever. And then I know we both watched Guy Martin's Last Flight of the Vulcan. Excellent documentary.
Yep.
and that got me all the more stoked. I don't know what that did for you, but
Yeah.
recently I sent Lee a link to a YouTube. It's out there called 617, The Last Days of the Vulcan Squadron. It's about 617, which was the Dam Buster Squadron of Lancasters. Eventually, as the Lancasters went offline, it became a Vulcan Squadron, 1982 or 84. I don't remember the year. That squadron is
It was around
being
there.
closed up, and they did a documentary on it. Now, the great thing, there's at least 2 training missions. You're in with the crew, and you can really get the feel what it's like to be in a Vulcan cockpit. So if you really want to geek out, if you haven't seen it
If you're a
already,
Vulcan fan.
go watch that and then jump into
Yeah.
Just Flight, and you're going to have yourself an absolute av nerd fest because it's just
I
perfect.
agree.
And
Yep, I agree.
the reason I'm kind of putting this to you as a question, Lee, is you weren't that big of a Vulcan fan coming into this project. I was the one who was like, we have to review the Vulcan. I must have it.
Sure.
But I noticed you've flown this thing more than I have this week. So
Yeah,
tell me about
actually,
that.
I have. Yeah. It's been an interesting. It's interesting in both the way it flies, that it's a different mission, right? You can't just go, I'm going to recreate this airline flight like you said. So I've actually been pounding around mostly Eastern Europe at this point. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. It's fantastically modeled. We watched that Guy Martin went over at your house, what, probably a year ago now, and the Dam Buster Squadron. I rewatched that last week as well, and yeah, it really is an iconic airplane, and Just Flight did a fantastic job capturing that. And I think if you have any interest in either British military aviation, the Vulcan, or historical significance of these type of strategic bombers, man, this kind of checks that box. It's really, really cool.
All right. So that's probably pretty much going to wrap it up, Sim Captains. So this is the Avro Vulcan B Mark II, including the K2 refueling tanker and maritime radar reconnaissance version for X-Plane 11. It is for sale over at justflight.com. It is currently running at US $49.99. For my take, I would have been willing to pay more than that for it. Honestly, I think it's just a fantastic quality level. As you've noticed in this thing, we only found one thing that they left out, and it was not an accident. They obviously did it on purpose.
Hmm.
So if you have any comments or thoughts, or if you found something in the Vulcan that we missed, be sure to leave it below in the comments because we'd love to chat about it. So until next time, Sim Captains, remember, plan the flight
And fly the plane.